call him Daddy again.
And that's how this video is starting.
Anyways.
Oh, also, friendly reminder, if you don't like watching us because we are, or I am ugly, then you can always just listen.
True. It actually was meant to be a listening thing. If you're watching us right now.
Just Apple Podcasts is kind of a pain in the you-know-what when it comes to uploading stuff, and you got to pay them money, and it's...
Yeah,
no.
so we're
broke.
And we're also a free podcast, and no return on investment.
Just listen to it on YouTube.
Please,
It's
take a few minutes. You know, you listen to music on YouTube. Or you could sub to YouTube. What is it? YouTube Red. You can play it with the app closed.
YouTube Red is so useless.
This is so pathetic.
YouTube Red is so...
The Cold War. All right.
All right, let's get to topic.
Wait, can I have an idea. Can I do a brief overview of the Cold War, and then afterwards you guys just like go really in depth and we can add stuff in?
Sure.
Because I feel like we miss a lot of the overview sometimes.
Yes.
Okay. So overview of the Cold War. Basically, coming out of World War II, there were these essentially two main superpowers afterwards: the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which is now kind of like modern day Russia-ish.
And some others.
Yeah, and some
states like Czechoslovakia.
And so basically, we came out, we had nuclear bombs, they did as well. And so for the Cold War is basically based on the idea that there's these two countries, in the beginning, the only ones with these huge weapons of mass destruction. And there was this whole debate on, are they going to bomb the world? Are they going to bomb each other? What's going to happen? And so because of that, this huge kind of like competition broke out. And so what became known as the arms race just kind of went off from there. And so ever since, those two things kind of sparked. The tensions were really, really high until the war ended.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good overview. It's a good start. And you see, like, it starts out with obviously nuclear weapons, partially fueled by the bombing of Japan. Twice America bombed them, because let's not get into that right now. And then Russia, developed their own weapons so they could attack America. Should that be necessary, the way America developed weapons and kind of put them on showcase for the world with the bombings of Japan. And then you had more conventional wars in Korea and Vietnam, afterwards Proxy Wars, in which case, obviously there's still a contention for ideals, like democracy versus communism. And you see those two competing ideals pretty much. You see them a lot in like South America, done in more covert ways, and in the Middle East in like the 70s and 80s. But you see them more overtly in actual wars or conflicts. War was never declared in Korea or Vietnam. And so and you see kind of a shift to try and not just like threaten each other with nuclear arms, but actually fight each other and go toe to toe on the battlefield.
Which again, because of the threat of nuclear bombs, everyone thought that would lead to like mass destruction. Like we had enough bombs after like the 50s to nuke the world over once.
Yeah, and the conventional wars were fueled by Truman and Kennedy in the case of Korea and Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, the Korean War, it was just Northern Korea under communist control just invaded South Korea completely out of the blue, and then U.S. and a couple, 20 other countries, and
it was
it was a lot of countries that just sort of ragtag together to try and create a defense force.
Spearheaded by the U.S. and South Vietnam.
Spearheaded by the U.S. and South Vietnam, under General MacArthur, who was
not in Vietnam.
No, not in Vietnam.
I'm talking about Korea.
Oh, that was Korea.
Yeah.
That was the entire UN. So
I'm talking about Korea.
Yeah, South Korea, the U.S.
Headed by General MacArthur, they were able to push Korea back and back and back until they were very close to China, at which point China gets involved because they knew very well that MacArthur wasn't going to stop at Korea and he was going to try and push into China because China was communist at the same time. And then once China got involved, MacArthur told Truman to nuke them, to which point Truman said no and fired him. North Korea was able to push back, and then it became a stalemate after that, until both sides finally sort of listen to each other nowadays.
And now there's the DMZ.
Mm-hmm. Now there's the DMZ.
More effective than the DMV.
Okay.
Yep. And then getting to Vietnam, you have the Northern Vietnamese invaded first, right? Or
Well,
I believe so. Yeah.
basically.
Okay. I know about this? Because I read up on the French Indochina War.
Go for it.
All right. So basically, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, that's like one of the biggest battles of the French Indochina War, and because Indochina, which is Vietnam, was a French colony before World War II, was taken by the Japanese during the war and given back to the French at the end of the war. And basically, they occupied it, and Dien Bien Phu was like that's the valley where the biggest French installations were, and the French garrison was. And so they suffered heavy losses over the course of 2.5, 3 months of fighting against the Vietnamese. But like the French controlled the entire country basically, based out of Hanoi. And then you had the Viet Minh, who were like guerrilla fighters. They functioned a lot like the VC, but also like the NVA later in the Vietnam War. And that was kind of one group. And then there were some Vietnamese that fought on the side of the French. And there were legionnaires, French legionnaires and whatnot, Moroccans and African soldiers in the French army. But basically, they get overrun after a period of a few months, and so many other people are taken captive, and they're treated very brutally in captivity. And that pushes the French to the negotiating table to get their soldiers back in exchange for Vietnamese independence. And this is in 1954, is this battle. In 1956, there were supposed to be national elections staged by the French or whatever, and it was supposed to be a unified country. That never happened, so then they split into a North and a South, and there were supposed to be democratic elections for each of them. North decided to be communist. The South was heavily influenced by the Americans. They also initially wanted to be communist, to the best of my knowledge. Patrick might be able to chime in.
Mm-hmm.
The South also wanted to be communist.
Yeah.
Yeah, or a lot of them. And you see the support in the VC there with some of the South Vietnamese supporting communism, but the Americans prop up No Dinh Diem, who's very brutal to a lot of his own people, which also drives a lot more anti-U.S. sentiment amongst the South Vietnamese, making that a very unpopular war, and then the war starts with the North attacking.
I think another thing that's important to note is that, like, you kind of mentioned it, like, both sides wanted a unified nation. They just had different ways of achieving that, not only with just, like, different levels of communism and different...
And that's the way it is with a lot of the proxy wars and the fighting during the Cold Wars. It's just one side wants to unify under democracy, one side wants to unify under a communist rule, and they just want to fight over who gets control of the country.
What's important to note is a lot of times the sides that back communism want a communist economy because they've been oppressed already by a authoritarian regime of some sort. And so they don't envision like some authoritarian communist government, they envision a true communist government. And the people that are fighting for a democratic government aren't envisioning this one where America backs anybody that disagrees with communism, regardless of how they treat their people. They're envisioning a true democratic system, much like America or other countries in developed Europe. So it's not like they're backing a fake version of a democracy. They want a true democracy, but the products they're getting. Same with communism. They want true communism, but the product they're getting is not what they want. So it's really, it comes out bad for both sides in these underdeveloped nations.
And that's the problem, is a lot of people hate communism without realizing. They hate it because they go like, oh, look at communism. It's failed every single time it's been implemented. A lot of the time, actually most of the time, it's never been true communism.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And like, going back, like, communism originally at its core was meant to be a really good thing and to help the people, and like I mean, it's obviously flawed. Like, a doctor with 12 years of schooling can't get paid as much as like someone who dropped out of high school, but essentially they wanted to like kind of try and end poverty by making the rates. So essentially, like, for a lot of poor countries, it appealed because it was meant to help people in poor nations come out and rise out of that kind of like stage of
The issue is it depends on unity. It depends on everybody being on board with it and everybody wanting this, and a lot of times people don't, because they feel like, if I've worked harder than somebody else, why should I get paid the same amount? Or for whatever various myriad of reasons, they might not want communism, and that kind of ruins the whole system, because if you just have a few people that don't want to do it, and because people are self-centered. Like, communism is dependent on the collective, and a lot of people just aren't into that. So.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. One more note. Okay. So also, when it was kind of weird, because when we first learned about this, I was like, why is the U.S. getting involved in all these different foreign affairs, like this was between the Vietnamese people and the Korean people. Like, why were we getting involved? One, the domino effect. We were afraid if that one country, Vietnam or Korea, whatever it was, if they fell, all the other surrounding countries in that geographical region would fall as well.
Especially during the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson and Kennedy, to a lesser extent, they were really concerned about if Vietnam falls, then Cambodia and Laos can fall, and then it might spread into India, maybe the Philippines, and then maybe all the way up to Japan.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of allies in that area, and we were trying to prevent the spread of it so that it wouldn't hamper with our allies that are there.
And finally, also, it wasn't, these wars weren't seen as kind of like the U.S. against the world. It was seen as, like you said before, like democracy versus communism. And not only the U.S., but mainly like the UN and stuff. They really played it so that communism was seen as the complete opposite of democracy. And they kind of made democracy out to be this wonderful, like, perfect solution to all these problems, and communists to be this huge, evil, like, dark kind of way, when in reality, both weren't necessarily perfect and both caused war.
And that's okay. Well, actually, I just noticed something, and I've been saying it wrong the whole time, so it's my fault too. But like we keep saying communism versus democracy, which is not what it is, because a lot of times people view it's like authoritarian regime versus authoritarian regime at a certain point, in a lot of cases actually. But but it's like capitalism versus communism. Like capitalism is seen as the more fair one. Like you work harder, you get more money. It doesn't work out that way if you have pure capitalism, obviously. But no, that's the idea. Communism, it's seen as everybody benefits from the collective good, and it doesn't always work out that way, obviously, as we've seen. And so it's a competition between these two, but also communism at the time was associated a lot with Russia, which is this horrifyingly violent and oppressive dictatorship, versus capitalism, which is seen as this big democracy, because like you look at America and how democratic everything is, and people get a say in the government. So it's not really a competition between a system of government and an economy. It's like two different types of governments, and it gets blurry because one is a misconception of a governmental theory, and then one is also a misconception of a governmental theory in a way.
Yeah,
and same with the economic side. It's
read Karl Marx's books. It's actually really interesting hearing what he was theorizing, because it makes a lot of sense on paper.
You read Marx?
Yeah.
I have read Marx's books.
Filthy commie. He's even wearing red.
Damn
Look
it.
at him.
Come on, look at dude.
No, it's interesting to know what he was thinking, because you hear all these things about, oh, Russia was communist, and we don't like communists around here because we're democratic and we support the Constitution and all these things. It's interesting to know what they were thinking.
Well, the Constitution doesn't really say much about the economy.
It's
Well,
the
it
same-
says some things. but-
It's the same thing about Mein Kampf. It's like, Hitler was a horrible person. It's interesting to understand what he was thinking
Yeah.
about those horrible things.
Like,
You
yeah.
need to understand both sides of an argument, both views, before you can make a formally well-rounded decision.
And ultimately, it's unfortunate because, again, I try not to get too opinionated, but without being too political about it, communism, or like, what was I going to say? Okay, yeah, the American war in Vietnam. It's rather unfortunate because you look at it, and it's actually a good opportunity for America to go in and put in a democratic regime which doesn't oppress its people and is very good to its
They
people.
already tried to do that, and obviously.
Well, yeah, but they backed an authoritarian regime disguised as a democracy.
That's what they did.
Yeah, well, no, but I'm saying it was an opportunity to put in actual democratic
That
government.
doesn't happen,
Yeah, well, yeah. No,
especially with the country as poorly developed as Vietnam.
okay,
That's
yeah,
never gonna happen.
that's a good point. But it's like unfortunate because it's a chance to like at least have stability in the area for America, or maybe not to implement, but even for America to like oversee the country to make sure that things are going all right. And you ultimately end up with just a huge mess. It's just a huge sticky mess of getting caught in a war that you're not really invested in, but you still have to keep fighting it because you're invested enough to keep fighting it, but you're not invested enough to go out and commit total war. And it's unfortunate because it's a chance for a country that had been oppressed by the French and by the Japanese to get freedom, get independence, and you end up seeing it as the puppet of two superpowers, and it ended up being bad for everyone. You know, a lot of people died in very cruel ways due to actions from both sides, and it's tragic. 'Cause
So,
On that dark note, enjoy your Friday if you're watching this on Friday. We're recording on Friday.
yeah, we record Fridays.
If it makes you feel any better, like there's nothing. You didn't do anything wrong.
It was all Kennedy's fault.
And that's how
You
we
want
should
to
end the episode.
screw off? All right. We'll see you next time, whenever that is.